Thank you, and thank you for having me here. It's really been a pleasure to be here. So my talk is going to be a little bit different. It's a philosophy talk, so I will have no fancy brain scan pictures or experimental results or anything such. It's a very, very low budget. And it's a part of this bigger ongoing project that I have in collaboration with Ernie Lepore from Rutgers on basically the question is about semantic knowledge and semantic competence. I am going to be talking about semantics of words, of word meanings, or lexical semantics. I'm not going to be talking specifically about concepts. So that's another way in which my talk will be a little bit different. But obviously, words are these tools we use to express our thoughts, right? And so these things are not going to be entirely unrelated, and hopefully the connections will be clear as we go along. So what is the project about? Well, basically, it's a clash of two kind of dominant lessons we got from two sides of philosophical tradition that we think are in tension. And so I'm going to start there by kind of introducing the problem. So what's the problem? So on the one hand, tradition tells you that successful communication requires shared content, right? So we mutually coordinate on a shared piece of information, or something like a truth condition of an utterance. So you can think about it in this very simple way. If I tell you it is raining outside, and you understand English, then you might recover a bit of content, namely that it is raining outside. If you think I'm reliable and sincere, right, that might even bring you to believe that it is raining outside, and that might impact your action. So you might decide to bring an umbrella along, right? But in order for all this to work, right, the idea is that you are supposed to understand my utterance to begin with and come to agree upon with me that the shared we should come to share the content that it is raining outside based upon me having uttered this sentence. So one way to cash it out is then to say that successful communication requires the audience to identify information that a speaker intended to convey, something like what is said by an utterance. And then what semantics does is it characterizes this content and allows you to basically recover what I intended to convey from what I actually uttered, right? And so the thought would be, unless the audience has some reason to think otherwise, they will take me to have intended to contribute whatever is the semantic content of my utterance, or some closely calculable information from that, some kind of pragmatic inference from that, right? So that's a kind of that seems sane. That's what semantics is good for, to allow us to communicate. But on the other hand, there is this other big lesson that we got from the past, you could say maybe 50 years of philosophical theorizing, and that is that, in fact, we actually are fairly ignorant about what many of our, well, maybe most, maybe even all of our terms mean. So what do I mean by that? That seems provocative, but here is a kind of a sort of a lesson that goes back to the work of so-called externalists, right, in philosophy of language and semantics, so people like Kripke, Putnam, and Burge. And they know that for a lot of our terms, ordinary speakers have actually very impoverished knowledge about what the meanings of those are. So to illustrate this, take something like one. If I tell you, I want some water, and you understand English again, you're likely going to, bring a bottle like that and allow me to quench my thirst. But if you think about it, this would have equally well worked, in the 16th century prior to discovery of what water was, right? And so even though we were vastly more ignorant about what water was, or what the term water denotes in the world, we're equally successful about going about communicating. And so the question is, how would we do that when we actually had such impoverished knowledge of what the content was? Or another illustration, if I tell you there's nicotine in cigarettes, it causes cancer, I might really not know at all what nicotine is, other than it's the stuff that's in cigarettes that causes cancer. It might not even be the unique thing in cigarettes that causes cancer. Most likely it's not, right? There's all sorts of nasty things in cigarettes that cause cancer. So it might not even uniquely identify this thing. And furthermore, for a lot of our terms, what ordinary speakers know about the meaning might be completely false, right? So I might think that, whatever, cigarettes are a type of drink, for instance, or something, right? And this still doesn't prevent me from saying true and false things about cigarettes, right? I can still convey to you my ignorance about the subject by using this word and conveying the same content. So how do I do that if I myself am not able to, to fully grasp what the content is, if I have to kind of defer to others on what the content is? Okay. So it seems like these two bits of tradition are in tension. On the one hand, we're supposed to share contents. On the other hand, we kind of don't know what the contents are, so how do we square those two things together? So we think this is a real problem. We have our own positive solution. I'm not going to present that today. What I'm going to look at is one particular way that's become popular, dominant, maybe promising, of trying to square these things together that we think don't work. That it doesn't work, right? Okay, so what is that? Well, here is a proposal in a nutshell. The idea is that we don't actually have to have prior semantic knowledge when we communicate. All that is required is that we're able to coordinate, so to speak, on the fly. That we're able to sort of negotiate the meanings as we go along so that we recognize each other's intentions, and that serves to kind of resolve the conflicts and disagreements in meaning for the purposes of a given conversation. So the idea would be, in a nutshell, whether the speaker is introducing a new meaning, so a fully novel term, as in the cases of lexical innovation, or whether an agent encounters an unfamiliar expression, communicative success is achieved through shared mutual recognition of relevant semantic properties, the content, right? But one that needn't be known prior to me having uttered the term, but is kind of reconstructed on the fly dynamically from reasoning about the utterance situation and each other's mental states. Right? Okay. To put some more meat on the bones of this, the idea is agents update or renegotiate the existing semantic conventions, the existing meaning-fixing conventions, by changing the meaning of an expression as they go, adjusting it as they go in the given context, or by adjusting the background conventions that already exist in a way that maybe broadens or narrows the extension of a term that's determined by the earlier standing meaning. Okay. Now, that might look a little bit abstract, so maybe it's good to kind of get a concrete example on the table and see how this is supposed to work. So this is an example of the so-called meta-linguistic negotiation, this supposed alleged negotiation over meanings. It's an example that goes back to, I think this example goes back originally to Peter Ludlow, but a number of other people in the literature discussed this particular one. So it's a real-life example from a sports radio where there was a debate over whether the horse, Secretariat, is an athlete or not. Now, what matters for the case is that all the relevant parties to the conversation know all the facts about Secretariat, right? They know this is a horse, right? Or this was a horse, right? They know how fast Secretariat was. They know which races he won. They know all the relevant ground facts, right? Which medals he won and so forth. But the disagreement is over whether he's an athlete or not, right? And so we might imagine that one of the parties to this debate would assent to 3, namely Secretariat is an athlete, and the other would dissent. It would say, no, Secretariat is not an athlete. Now, the observation you're supposed to draw from this is that given that the relevant factual matters, what we know about Secretariat, is mutually shared, the natural way to describe this debate is over the meaning of the term athlete, quote unquote, not over the ground facts which are not under dispute. So in a way, you might imagine that the resolution of this debate, at least for the purposes of this conversation that we're engaged with, would be then to reconstruct the meaning of athlete for this given occasion, right? So we might agree, okay, maybe there are good reasons to count horses as well, be more inclusive, right? So in that case, we would agree that, at least for the purposes of our conversation, athlete would have this wider meaning. Or maybe we might agree to narrow down. And you may think that similar kinds of things then might be going on with the ignorance cases as well. So in a way here, obviously there's some ignorance going on if we assume that athlete has a specific meaning. And I'm going to take that assumption for now. I'm going to question it in a little bit. But if we assume that the expression has a specific meaning, right, then obviously there wouldn't be a debate unless at least one of the parties to the debate were ignorant about what its meaning was, right? So no prior knowledge of the convention, at least not the one exhibited by this example. Okay. Now, we're going to take issue with this idea that we construct meanings on the fly, and in fact, that we at all negotiate meanings. We think meanings are non-negotiable. They're fixed prior, and they are unaffected by either our ignorance or our background beliefs about the subject matter in question. And so we're going to push back against this supposed strategy of meta-linguistic negotiation. Now, we're going to do that by first considering several ways in which you can understand the proposal, which have oftentimes been drawn together in this literature. In particular, we are going to ask, well, what exactly is that the negotiation is about? What is being negotiated? One way to try to understand this is to say that there is an ambiguity in question and which we're trying to resolve. So maybe there's really two or potentially two items, athlete and athlete star. We're kind of trying to figure out which one to use or which one we ought to use, maybe, if you think that this is a normative question. Maybe we are really negotiating lexical meaning. There's one term, athlete, right? And then there's competing meanings, and then the choices about which meaning to assign to this term or which meaning to associate with this term, right? Maybe that's what it's about, okay? And then finally, maybe there isn't a specific meaning to the term athlete. Maybe the meaning is just sort of a skeleton or is underspecified, and then you kind of have to put some meat on the bones of it as you go, right? You have to narrow down or eliminate or reduce under specification for a given context so as for the utterance to have a determinate truth value. So maybe that's what's going on, right? Oftentimes, these are drawn together in this literature. We think they're importantly different, but we also think none of those actually work, right? And so that's what we're going to argue. And further, and I think more worrisome for the present proposal is that even if any of these strategies worked, none of them are going to guarantee the shared linguistic content that the tradition was positing as a key to successful communication. So no way of negotiating was going to give us the shared content of the sort that seems required for us to get things done in the world and push each other's mental states around. Okay. And then the question is, well, what then are we doing? What are these negotiations about? What is the dispute about? And we're going to suggest that the disputative cases of negotiation are really cases of non-linguistic empirical inquiry into the subject matter under discussion. Okay. That's a sort of a outline. Let's see how far we get. Okay. So first distinction I want to draw is between real meaning negotiation and lexical ambiguity. I kind of foreshadowed this already. So you should distinguish the process whereby a meaning of a single term is negotiated from the cases where we are disambiguating and making a lexical choice, right? So a meaning negotiation, as the term suggests, right, would be a case where you have a single word and several candidate meanings, several properties maybe that could be denoted. And the subject of negotiation is which property is actually denoted or should be denoted by this term, right? So trying to settle on one potential out of many competing meanings of a single word, athlete, right? Disambiguation is different. Disambiguation is choice between different lexical items, right? So there's two words really, or two items, right? And what you're doing is trying to figure out which one should we use, right? And maybe that's a normative question. Okay, so a lot of people say, well, that's just your philosopher's distinction, but nobody really cares. It's just, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. These are the same, really. No important theoretical distinction. This is often assumed, is explicitly voiced in some of the literature on linguistic negotiation, some originating from Dartmouth as well. But we think this is wrong. There is an important distinction. First, notice that if this is really about ambiguity, if athlete is actually ambiguous, this is in a way a kind of a crazy proposal, because that would suggest that, in which ways is then athlete ambiguous? Is it ambiguous for any given variation between speakers along any dimension they can disagree about? But if that's so, there's in principle indefinitely many dimensions over which we can disagree about whether something is an athlete, right? So for instance, even if we agree that non-human animals can be athletes, we might disagree whether chess players are athletes, or maybe whether golf players are athletes, or maybe if there were robots, whether those could be athletes, right? So, and this just multiplies, right? And this then becomes implausible because you would then have to posit indefinitely many lexical items for indefinitely many variations in meanings. We don't want indefinite ambiguity because that explodes the lexicon, right? And so it seems like a bad proposal, right? We don't want that. When we say, well, that's awfully uncharitable, nobody would have thought that, right? So maybe something else is really going on. Maybe athlete is not actually ambiguous in indefinitely many ways. Maybe you could say it's just potentially ambiguous in indefinitely many ways. So we have this one term athlete, but maybe what we're doing when we are engaged in this kind of negotiation is we are negotiating whether to introduce a novel term into the language, which would vary from the existing one in a certain way, right? So maybe we are pursuing lexical choice by arguing that athlete is only potentially ambiguous, and the debate is whether or not to introduce a homonym into a language, right? A new word also happens to be pronounced and spelled as athlete, right? Which would then have this different kind of meaning, right? This avoids indefinite actual ambiguity because you're only incrementing a language one item at a time, but we think it's also problematic. So why is this problematic? Well, even if athlete is not actually ambiguous, if athlete is not actually ambiguous, then at most one of these agents, assuming that meanings are not underspecified, I'm going to leave under specification until a further point in the talk, but assuming that meanings are specific, right, then at most one of the agents here is going to be speaking truthfully when they're saying that secretariat is an athlete, right? Now, let's suppose just for the sake of the argument that, say, 4 is true. Athlete has this chauvinistic exclusive meaning. It excludes non-human animals. Well, if that's so, then according to the present proposal, then 3 suggests that we should extend this meaning. We should endorse a term that has an extended meaning that covers not just humans, but also non-human animals. So that will be what the proposal is about. But the problem is it's really hard to see how an utterance of 3 succeeds to do that if what we're doing is trying to introduce a novel term that just happens to sound the same. Why is it hard? Well, the thought would be you're using the term in its ordinary meaning. If you're using the term in its ordinary meaning, you're just saying something false. By saying something false, how are you now somehow suggesting to introduce a different word which would make your utterance true? It seems like this is an unconstrained process. Notice it's not that a single word athlete is used with a non-standard meaning so that you can have a kind of a pragmatic inference, but rather that you're proposing to introduce a different term that has this new different meaning, right? Maybe this is a bit quick. Maybe you can think, well, perhaps there's a kind of a pragmatic inference here. So because I'm saying something obviously false, because I'm using the term athlete to, in a way that suggest that I'm ignorant of its meaning, then maybe I'm pragmatically conveying that I think it shouldn't be used as it's normally used, that we should be having this other term which has the extended meaning instead. So by saying something that is blatantly false, I'm trying to introduce a different term into the language. I'm trying to neologize, if you like, right? But the problem is that this seems to presuppose the knowledge of meaning of the actual term athlete, that then a violation of which would then trigger this kind of a pragmatic inference. And we've seen at the beginning that the knowledge of this term is what's under dispute to begin with. It seems like precisely why we are arguing is that we're not clear about what the actual term means, right? Okay. So that seems like a problem. But even setting this aside, there is a deeper problem with disambiguation as strategy. So as I already said, disambiguation is not a process whereby a new meaning is attached to an existing term. And given that this is so, disambiguation gives you a very strange answer to the kind of a normative question that's at stake in this debate. So in particular, why would anybody care whether you introduce a similarly sounding term that just happens to have a different meaning, right? Why would that be a normative advancement of any sort, right? How could that resolve what's at stake in the debate about whether Secretariat is an athlete? So to just bring this intuition about, so notice that it would be a super unsatisfactory resolution of this debate if I just said, well, like, forget about athlete, let's introduce this other term, schmathlete, which covers both humans and non-humans, right? And reserve athletes for just humans, and then we can all agree that Secretariat is a schmathlete. You would think, well, yeah, that's great, right? But that's not what we cared about, right? What we want to know is whether Secretariat should be included in a certain kind of a list and deserve certain kind of a praise, and that was what was under discussion when we talked about whether he's an athlete, right? So introducing two distinct terms just completely kind of misses the point of the debate. Okay. So maybe you might think, well, maybe it's the term athlete that plays a kind of a normative and functional role within our social life, and then that role is not transferred to this other alternative term, schmathlete, right? Some people have proposed these kinds of, said things along these lines. But the problem is that there isn't anything that guarantees that a novel homophonous term would play this role any more than the novel non-homophonous term would play this kind of a normative role. So there's nothing about the term that makes it meaningful and significant in a certain normative sense. Right? Okay, so that seems like a bad route. Well, how about genuine meaning negotiation? That's maybe more interesting, right? The idea would be you have a single word, but now its meaning is malleable, right? You can kind of negotiate it as you go. You can change it, extend it, and broaden it and narrow it down. Maybe just even for the purposes of a single context and a single conversation. Maybe meanings are just kind of dynamically shifting, changing things. Maybe that's the way to explain this. So that will be negotiation over the meaning of a single expression. Well, here's the first worry. So if speakers belong to, in our Secretariat debate, if the two speakers belong to the same, say, linguistic community, if you like, so they belong to the same network of social and historical chains that connect their terms to the originating event, say the event where somebody introduces the term athlete into the language, then, assuming this kind of a causal social transfer of meaning, then in their mouth, athlete will have the same meaning if it has any meaning at all, right? So the idea would be like this. At some point, somebody introduces the term athlete into the language. Maybe at that point, the term gets its meaning, let's say, assuming a good case. And then, this spreads out through the linguistic community so that everybody who inherits the meaning from the originator, right, through a set of causal, historical, and social network connections, right, then uses the term athlete in the same way to denote the same thing, right? And that's what allows us to defer to others in our and sort of avoid our ignorance by relying on semantic competence of the rest in our network. Well, that's also, if that's so, then the meaning of the terms in my mouth are going to be the same as everybody else's in my linguistic community, and so there can't really be a variation of the sort that seems presupposed in the debate. Why is the variation presupposed? Well, the negotiation strategy presupposes that speakers, and under this understanding, presupposes that speakers are expressing compatible content because they're using two terms in different ways, right? So one is using the term in an extended way and the other in a more narrow, restrictive way, and the debate is over which one should win out, right? And that's because of their background beliefs and intentions about what the term means or what a term should mean, right? But if background beliefs have no effects on what athlete actually means in anybody's mouth, because they can be ignorant about what the term actually means, right? They can be semantic ignorance, then whatever I believe about the meaning of the term is going to have no effect about what the term actually means when I utter it. And so I can only mean whatever the semantic grounding rules determine the word to mean in my linguistic community. So the meanings don't change. Okay. That's a kind of first prima facie worry, which just goes back to our original observation. We can be ignorant about the meanings, so our background beliefs about what the meanings are or should be can't really affect what they are because of the underlying semantic ignorance. Okay, here's the second worry. So if the debate gets resolved, so suppose the debate gets resolved in a certain way, suppose it gets resolved to include non-human animals, well, if so, it would be surprising if this effect was only to affect the English word athlete and not the rest of the items in other languages, right? That would be really bizarre. But if this is the negotiation about the meaning of a single lexical item in English, right, namely athlete, then it shouldn't affect at all what happens in Finnish or Japanese or Swedish. I'm not going to try to pronounce any of these, but I'm told they all should correspond to athlete. If these are unrelated words that just happen to share a meaning, then changing the meaning of one wouldn't affect the change of meanings in others. It's just a coincidence that these words are translations. Okay, well, that seems bad. It can't be that that's what we mean when we're the debate about whether Secretariat is an athlete is not just exclusively a debate about English and has no effect on, say, Japanese, right? That would be really strange. Okay, maybe you might think, well, that's also uncharitable. That's unfair. Nobody thought that, right? Surely something more serious was, if such correlations were forced due to maybe such correlation is forced due to a particular role that the term athlete plays in our lives. Maybe that's why it's difficult to see how each term in each language that just happens to mean athlete would play this kind of a role, if not in virtue of what it means, right? So if you change the meaning of the word athlete to suddenly denote rocks, you would not thereby, it seems like it will lose this kind of a special role, right? It seems like the role is connected to the meaning. Okay. You might think, well, here is how you can sort of get away around this worry. You might say, well, look, athlete, the word in English, right? And all its translational counterparts, they happen to express the same concept, right? And that's what this is all about, right? And so maybe what the debate is about is really a conceptual, the debate about what the concept should pick out. And maybe it's the conceptual change we undergo when we settle this debate. So if we resolve the Secretariat debate so that he falls under the athlete category, that wouldn't just affect English, it would affect our concept of athlete, and then all the lexical items that express this concept would then undergo the same type of change. So this would avoid the translation worry. But the problem is that, and so the thought will be when we resolve disputes like 3 and 4, it is the informational content denoted by the concept that undergoes the change, right? So people have again suggested things along these lines as well. But we think this is problematic as well. So first, this presupposes that the content of a concept can change, right? That's controversial. I'm not going to argue against that here. I'm just going to point that out. So the idea that you can still have the same concept athlete that all these items denote, but that somehow its meaning can change, right? That at least seems suspicious. Second, it presupposes that concepts play a certain kind of a normative role regardless of their content, so that the concept athlete plays its kind of a role in our cognitive and social lives for organizing our thoughts about a certain thing, regardless of the fact that it expresses a particular content, namely it denotes the property of being an athlete, right? But again, and we've seen this worry when we discussed disambiguation as well, the worry is what it is in virtue of which a concept could play such a role, if not in virtue of what its meaning was, right? And just to kind of emphasize that, so if the content of a concept could dramatically change, so that, say, the concept athlete now comes to denote rocks or inanimate objects or something completely random, well, presumably it would no longer serve such role in organizing our cognitive and social and maybe normative lives, right? So it seems like this doesn't explain that at all. Okay. Well, maybe you can try there is, even if you thought, take that as you may, but there are further worries. So saying that both words or concepts shift in their meanings seems to also have kind of bizarre or unattractive empirical predictions. So suppose you said that the meaning of the word athlete or the concept athlete changed as a result of a linguistic negotiation. Then it seems like it's natural to say a thing like 5. We thought Secretariat was so suppose we resolve this debate. We decide that Secretariat is an athlete after all. We decide to be inclusive. Then it seems like upon the resolution of this debate, we should be able to say 5. Well, we thought that Secretariat was an athlete, but we were wrong, right? That's the whole point of the resolution of this debate. But if what has gone on is that we change the meaning of the word athlete, then that 5 should be false. You shouldn't be able to truly say it. Because after all, the meaning of the word athlete changed. And we never thought that Secretariat was not an athlete on its new meaning, right? Which is the one that's now denoted by this term, right? So given that now here the token of athlete expresses the new meaning, there is no way of expressing 5, save of saying something like, quote unquote, athlete used to not apply to Secretariat, but now it does, right? And it seems like 5 is a completely natural thing to say. That seems like a result of the debate, a report on what happened. Okay, so we think that's bad, that's unattractive. But you might think, okay, so suppose this was really not about the meaning of the word athlete. How then are we supposed to explain what is that we were wrong about once we resolved this debate? If this is not the disagreement about what athlete means, what else could it be a disagreement about if, after all, we know all the facts about Secretariat? So we knew that he was a horse, which races he won, and so forth. Which facts could be missing that we are disagreeing over when we're disagreeing over whether the Secretariat is an athlete or not? And we think that the answer to this is obvious and kind of trivial, but for some reason has been missed. So the obvious answer is, of course, that the fact that we're disagreeing over is whether Secretariat is an athlete or not, right? That's a fact. And surely it's a relevant fact, right? And you might think, well, there's something fishy about it. That's not fair. Presumably, these other facts that we know about athletes about Secretariat should tell us whether he's an athlete or not. So how could the idea would be something like it can be a brute fact about Secretariat that he's an athlete. He's probably an athlete in virtue of all these other properties that he might have that we all, by assumption, know. So how can we dispute this fact, whether he's an athlete or not? We think that this argument goes wrong in the following way. It presupposes that speakers should know, in virtue of knowing the facts, whether Secretariat is an athlete or not. But the whole point of linguistic ignorance is that it's possible to have a concept athlete and to use the term, English term, quote unquote, athlete, without being able to articulate or fully articulate or truthfully articulate the conditions anything should satisfy in order to be an athlete. That's the whole point of potentially being ignorant about the meanings of terms, right? And so that's why we can disagree about whether Secretariat is an athlete, even though we know all the other background facts about what that we might deem relevant for whether he is or not. Okay. Finally, and I think most importantly for our purpose, so even if you thought that meanings did change in the relevant way, even if the meaning change was a viable solution, the problem is that it will still not guarantee the kind of a shared content that's the standard simple account of communication that I began with presupposed. And this response applies both to the meaning change case and the ambiguity case. So why is that? Why is the shared meaning not guaranteed? Well, we already said for successful communications, agents must mutually recognize the content expressed by one another's utterance. But there isn't any guarantee that the speaker knows the meaning of the word athlete in the relevant case. Precisely that's why it's under dispute, right? And there is no guarantee in particular that they know anything more than just something trivial or meta-linguistic, like, athlete denotes whatever it denotes in English, right? So even if the speaker of 3, who says secretariat is an athlete, believes that in her dialect athlete applies to non-human animals, given the possibility of semantic ignorance, this is no guarantee that that's actually a part of the meaning of the term. And furthermore, and more worrisomely, she might have other false beliefs about the property denoted by the word athlete. And in general, she might not be able to articulate anything much more than just the fact that what her utterance meant is that secretariat is an athlete. And so given that even the speaker can be ignorant of this sort, it just follows that there's no mutual recognition. Since there's no recognition on the part of the speaker to begin with, there's not going to be mutual recognition of the relevant semantic property. OK, so that's a problem. That it seems like even if this worked, it wouldn't give us the shared content that we wanted. So in short, the negotiation strategy and the dynamic meaning hypothesis do not secure shared linguistic content robust enough to explain how through communication we're able to push each other's mental states around and get things done in the world. OK, and so there's just a final possibility I want to consider that I've been kind of bracketing for now. So maybe you might think, well, what you've done so far, you've assumed that the meaning of the word is specific. It's fully determined, right? But maybe meanings are not specific in this way. Maybe there is underspecification. And what we're doing when we are negotiating, we're kind of resolving underspecification, right? And in that sense, if we recognize the ways in which we're trying to resolve underspecification, then for the purposes of conversation, we can arrive at a single solution, right? So there's 2 ways you can kind of try to substantiate this. One would be to say that the word athlete, quote unquote, has a fully specific meaning, but its successful communication only requires us coordinating on some aspect of this meaning. So maybe just on the property of they're denoting non-human animals or something like that. Or you might think, no, athlete itself has a standing linguistic meaning that's underspecified. The background semantic conventions fix the meaning that doesn't fully determine an extension. And what we are doing in a context is we're trying to narrow down this underspecification. So that's the kind of an approach that Ludlow has argued for. So basically what we think is wrong with this is exactly what was wrong with the specific meanings account. Namely, just as you can be ignorant about specific meanings, you can be ignorant about underspecified meanings. And you might get the same kind of a mismatch that's not going to guarantee shared content. Why is that? Well, here's the problem with the first way of specifying running the underspecification account. So the thought would be for any characterization of contents that agents can potentially coordinate upon, there is no guarantee that correctly characterizes the meaning of the term in their dialect, because after all, they can be ignorant about the ways in which the term is actually underspecified, unless we assume some analytic syntactic distinction and presuppose that there are characterizations of the relevant property which are analytic and which the agents cannot be ignorant of. And it's not clear what those would be. So one way to kind of see what I've done so far is I started with this kind of 2 problems on the one, or two bits of wisdom, if you like. On the one hand, the possibility of semantic ignorance. On the other hand, the possibility of successful communication. You might think that what we are ending up with is a position in which we have to reject one of the 2 lessons. But insofar as you think there can be semantic ignorance of the relevant sort, then it seems like there's no guarantee there's going to be shared content, even if those contents are underspecified. And the problem with 2 is going to be the same. So suppose that when agents speak, they aim for the purposes of conversation to just narrow down under the underdetermination enough so that their utterance can have a determinate truth value. And so the thought would be then the standing meanings provide just constraints on the ways in which the specification can go, because presumably not everything goes. So presumably, the standing meanings constrain possible ways in which we can narrow indeterminacy. in particular, not everything goes, right? So as I was saying earlier, if you can't resolve under the determinacy of athletes so that now athletes come to denote rocks or something like that. You would be doing something odd, right? That's not along the lines of whatever are the constraints of underdetermination. But then this poses a problem or a question. What exactly is this core meaning that constrains the ways in which we can sharpen or reduce the underspecification? If it's going to be rich enough, then there's going to be potential ignorance about what it is. And if it's super impoverished so that it merely gives a weak constraint, then it's not going to distinguish between different items along the same class of expressions that share a particular core structure, right? And so it seems like either it's going to give us trivial knowledge of meaning or it's going to give us something that we can be ignorant about, right? That's the idea. And just the bottom line is that presumably ignorance and error can apply equally to underspecified meanings just as they can apply to specific meanings, right? So you can be equally ignorant about something underspecified just as you can be ignorant about something that's specific. Okay. So given the network model of meaning transfer, if there is a core meaning, it's going to be grounded in the network, in the background semantic conventions that fix the standing meaning for the given linguistic community. But if we can be mistaken about the precise meanings, we can be mistaken about imprecise ones. So that's sort of what I already said. So here's one way to make this concrete. Suppose that the word athlete applies to both humans and non-human animals as a part of our underspecified meanings, but it is underdetermined whether it applies to chess players, right? That's a case that's not covered by the standing convention of English. So let's just assume for the purposes of the argument. Then a speaker who utters for believing it to be underdetermined or false that a horse can be an athlete is mistaken about the underspecified meaning, right? Because the underspecified meaning specifies that horse can be an athlete. It just underspecifies whether chess players can be so, right? So that's just an illustration about how we can be ignorant about underspecified meanings, the same way as we can be ignorant about specific ones. So, and this is what I just said, right? So unless we assume that the core meaning is such that agents cannot be mistaken about them, then we face exactly the same problem. But then the problem is going to be what's going to be this core meaning that's going to be rich enough to distinguish between different items within the same class of expression, but not rich enough so that we can be ignorant about the aspects of it. Right? Okay. Then what's left? Well, what about our original debate? When we say Secretariat is an athlete and somebody disagrees, what is this disagreement about, if not about what athlete means? Well, we want to say, well, it's the debate over athletehood, over the features of the property of being an athlete, not over the English word athlete or the concept athlete. The agents are engaged, if you like, in an inquiry about the underlying features of the relevant property, and what allows them to engage in this kind of inquiry is precisely their capacity to talk about athletes by using the English word athlete, right? And then trying to figure out more about this phenomenon, right? And then the question is, well, how do we do that if we require kind of shared contents? We think that has to do with this kind of empirical inquiry. But as I said, I'm gonna leave that aside for now. Okay. So in conclusion, we have argued that meanings are non-negotiable. The alleged meta-linguistic negotiation scenarios are neither adequately described as negotiations, nor over the choice of an expression, nor over the disambiguation of the meaning of a particular expression. And so neither is this the question of which lexical item we should use, nor is the question of which meaning we should associate with a particular lexical item. And more worrisomely, even if we were able to negotiate meanings in this way, this would still not help to help our original simple story about communication, because it wouldn't guarantee the kind of shared contents which are transparent to the users in a way that is rich enough to explain how we can, affect each other's beliefs and mental states, and how that can then impact our action in a way that allows us to get things done in the world. All right. And I think that's all I'm going to do for now, and leave some time for questions.
Thank you very much, Una. So, questions, comments? Oh, great. Adina.
Hi, thanks for that. So I'm still not entirely certain what your proposal is, but I guess what I actually thought that the metalinguistic negotiation people were really talking about is, assuming that we have, let's say, prototypical or agreement about cases and sort of a prototype of our concept, where do we draw the boundaries? And so, I mean, that reminds me of Peter's slide with the ducks and the goose and stuff. And
Yes.
So where do we want to say that those boundaries lie? But I think that's, I mean, I think they see this as a pragmatic and normative kind of question, because in some sense we have voluntary control about where we say those boundaries lie.
Good. So, as I said, this talk was mainly critical, right? So I haven't given you a full account of the positive solution, other than just saying it's about empirical inquiry. I can flesh it out a little bit more. So you're right that the way people often talk is as if this is about, we have some prototypical cases and then we're supposed to extend it in a certain kind of a way. The worry is exactly explaining what those prototypical cases are and how does that have to do, what that has to do with meaning, right? And so I started off with these two assumptions. On the one hand, we can be vastly ignorant about the meanings of our terms, and on the other hand, we're successfully communicating by sharing meanings, right? And the problem with that is that if you think that we can be vastly ignorant about the meanings of our terms, there's no guarantee, even if there is something that we would deem a prototypical case, that is actually denoted by anything that we understand as meaning of a term, right? So to kind of make this a bit more concrete, so think about the case of water prior to the discovery of the 18th century. Everybody was ignorant about what water was. Maybe even the prototypical cases weren't really prototypical cases of water, right? Because it's polluted in all sorts of ways and so forth. But that didn't affect what the meaning was. We don't want to say they talked about something completely different, right? We want to say they were wrong about what water was, not they were wrong about what water means, right? And so that's the worry, right? Now, of course, you can take that as a kind of refutation of the possibility of ignorance of this sort. Yeah. We would take that already to be a big result. But it seems like there is at least a tension between these two positions that we're trying to bring out here.
I mean, I think part of that problem is that the position is sort of conceived in the ether and not in embodied beings that are interacting with concrete objects that can be co-interacted with, right? So there isn't really a problem of reference if you're both reaching for the same glass of water.
Well, so there's the question of whether there isn't a problem of reference, or whether there's a sense in which we perfectly agreed, and that's now addressing the second question as well, what's the positive proposal, right? So we are agreeing that we are successful in communicating, right? So how do we do that? And our answer is that in a sense, we do have a perfectly shared meaning. So both you and I know that water denotes water, right? In this kind of boring, this quotational sense, or that water picks up whatever water picks out, right? We know that, and that guarantees a shared meaning. That's going to determine, well, assuming that we take under determination off the table, that's going to determine a proposition that is either going to be true or false of our situation that we share. That when I say, you're going to pick up on. But that's not going to give us a kind of a robust knowledge about that's going to allow us to we'll get out of empirical inquiry, right? And that seems to be presupposed in this kind of shared. So suppose you hear this term for the first time. I tell you, I want a glass of water, and you understand this, but now you don't know what water is. You're not going to be able to comply with my request just on the basis of sharing meaning with me, right? And so that's where the problem enters, right? So how is it that we get the knowledge off the ground, given that we have this kind of very, very impoverished, very thin shared meanings, right? Do you see?
Yeah, I guess I disagree with the characterization of the problem. I think we have very robust shared meanings in the kinds of cases where the things that, the meaning of the words that we're concerned with refer to tangible objects that we interact with.
So is the question just how broad the ignorance can extend?
I think that there are enough cases in which the ignorance is not, it's not, like the elm, my can't remember what the other tree was. Beach elm distinction, right? There's the water and the Coca-Cola, and we don't have big problems in the realm of reference in which we interact directly with the world.
So we don't have a problem with identifying things, but that's, we want to say, partly because we know a lot about water, not because we know a lot about water, right? So in particular, our capacity to successfully use the term water didn't presuppose that we were antecedently knowledgeable about the difference between water and Coca-Cola. That's what allowed us to talk about it and then go about our empirical inquiry and gather knowledge about the difference that allowed us then to classify these things in different ways. So even if I hear this term for the first time and I ask, well, is that water? I would have asked a sensible question using the term with its grounded meaning, even though I have no way of classifying water apart from Coca-Cola or whiskey or anything else, right? Or you can imagine this kind of child acquiring knowledge kind of scenario, acquiring meaning scenario where they hear the word doggy for the first time and then they go, is that a doggy, is that a doggy? It's not like they're not participating in a language game or just reference failure all over the place. They have no way of classifying. That's why they're asking the follow-up questions. But they're, by using the term, engaged in this inquiry that now allows them to learn more about the underlying property that then can be leveraged and used in our interactions that allows us to get things done in the world. And so this notion of reference that allows us to get things done in the world, we want to say, is not really a matter of meaning. The meaning was there prior to our acquiring enough knowledge to separate things out in the right kind of a way.
Okay, we can talk about it
Yes.
later.
I have first of all a question of clarification, and secondly a comment or a suggestion. In theories of meaning, there is a fundamental division between theories of meaning that connect them to truth conditions. I mean, this is part of analytic philosophy. And on the other hand, cognitive linguistics or cognitive semantics that say that meanings are mental things, they don't, they're not connected. And it sounds to me that you belong to the philosophical tradition.
I prefaced my talk with, I'm a philosopher and this is a philosophy talk.
Yeah. So you think meanings are connected to truth conditions, and that's why you would say that the Secretariat is an athlete is a false sentence. I don't like this. I mean, I belong to the cognitive. I'll belong to the cognitive camp, definitely. Yeah. And for me, I mean, this is the suggestion. What's happening here is something like what's going on in metaphor. I mean, this is an extension of the meaning of athlete, so you go from humans to horses and maybe to other places. Let me give you another example. Take the word face. I mean, humans have faces. And we don't hesitate to say that horses and dogs and cats have faces. When we get to fish or snakes, they have faces. How about caterpillars? When we get to tapeworms or octopuses, I mean, we're really hesitating. But it's the same kind of process as metaphors. Some metaphors are easy. I mean, it's easy to understand what's meant by saying that secretary is an athlete, because it's a kind of metaphorical extension. Understanding the expression is no problem. Then the question of whether it's true or not is for me not very interesting. The question is whether you can communicate, and I think that in this case it's not a problem to communicate.
Good. So that's a big question. But let me just say a couple of things and see where that gets us. So, with respect to the metaphor suggestion, so I do see the sentiment where you might say, well, surely what this is we're kind of trying to push each other around to extend the term in a certain way, and maybe we're not clear whether it extends in this way in this particular case, right? So maybe you're in a way putting another spin on this sort of a pragmatic solution that I was illustrating earlier, where I said, well, here is a kind of a more charitable way of explaining what's going on. Let's see where that was here. Maybe they're pragmatically conveying, maybe metaphorically conveying that the term should be used in this extended, non-standard way. And the worry with that was precisely, so what determines that something is a metaphorical use of a term is that it's non-standard, it doesn't belong to the core. Now, my problem is already with the core, right? So how do you isolate something that's the core meaning that's not metaphorical, that you can then use to say, oh, this is what I'm extending in this kind of a way? And the ignorance about a meaning already enters in this first stage, right? So that's where the worry starts already. So in order to run a pragmatic inference on something, you have to know what you're running it on to begin with, right? Otherwise, you can't even get off the ground. And so that's part. You can say the same thing about truth conditions as well. If in order to go beyond the truth conditions, you have to first have the truth condition to springboard your pragmatic inference from that point on. Another thing I want to say also with respect to like things that have faces, that how you're gonna, whether that's an extension of a term or not, is also going to depend on what the core meaning is. And in fact, you might get, we do get variations in what kinds of things we can call have faces across different languages. For instance, you wouldn't say the same thing has faces. Sure. You wouldn't use the word face the same way. So that's another worry. And then with respect to whether it's true or false, so partly what allows us, so I started with this very simple-minded picture that I think is roughly right? So when we communicate, so I have a thought about the world. I want to convey to you. So I look out the window and see, suppose it was raining, right? I see that it's raining. I want to now convey to you. And I find some words that I believe in this context are going to bring this thought to you, right? So I say, it's raining. And then you, understanding English, uncover this content. And then if you think I'm reliable, you might come to believe it. And then that might affect your action, and you might bring an umbrella. But it seems like the underlying features that makes this explanation work precisely have to do with truth reference and satisfaction, right? The fact that it's true about the world, that it's raining, right? And that that was why I uttered my sentence to begin with, because that's what grounded my thought, and that's what made me want to convey to you so that you can bring an umbrella, right? If we disassociate that, then this kind of an explanation, it seems like it loses its ground. So that's partly why I'm in the truth reference and satisfaction camp. Even though I don't think that's exhaustive of what it is to say about meaning, but I think that is kind of a foundation that's needed for meaning. So
I've seen that Ray's really desperately trying to say something.
I have about 1 million comments on
All right,
it.
good. Well, I have time.
Yeah, you have time. The first thing that occurred to me when you came up with the Secretariat example was Pluto.
Yeah.
Right, now it
Pluto.
was, 10, or,
Yes.
well, now it's maybe 20 years ago, Pluto as a planet was true, and
Yes.
now it's false, and nothing has changed in
Yes.
the world. Only thing that has changed is the declaration by the International
Good.
Organization of Astronomers, what the meaning is, right?
Yes, Pluto.
Or another example of meaning change, which was maybe not deliberate, is that's your slide. Slides didn't used to be like that. Slides used to be little rectangular things you put in a machine and slid in, which is why they're called slides.
Good.
Now, are we changing when exactly what's happening? Now, I think that it seems to me. Let me soften it up first.
At which point it is
All
okay
right.
to start to
sorry.
answer. Just let me know.
Soften it up by saying, look, when we disagree about, or when we don't coincide, when we don't have totally shared phonology, so we have different accents, we sort of apply a certain amount of tolerance and let it go and understand it as best we can. I'd like to think maybe the same thing is going on in semantics. So if we say athlete, let's say, is connected to slightly different concepts in the two speakers, and they're negotiating, they're realizing, up till now it hadn't made any difference until one of them applies it to Secretariat, right? And now they say, oops, we don't exactly have a shared concept, let's talk about that. And it might be that it ends up, like you say tomato and I say tomato. You call it an athlete because you include animals. Okay, I'll let you do that. Or it might be, no, you're wrong, because there's a presupposition that content is shared. And so the reply, no Secretariat isn't an athlete, is like a presupposition correction, right? So it's not exactly... it's metalinguistic denial, not fact-based denial,
Fact-based,
whatever,
yes.
right? So it's taking background assumption of shared content and foregrounding the mismatch, rather than just sort of letting it go. Okay, so secretaries and ethnic. Yeah, okay, if that's the way you want to put it, all right.
Good.
But this has no effect on. So I'm seeing the problem in using the term "the meaning of the word." It's the meaning of the word in this person's head versus in that person's head, and the discovery that they didn't match. Right, yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. Okay.
So I'll stop there.
Yeah. Do I start answering now?
Go ahead,
now?
start.
Okay. Good. All right. Yeah, so first I do want to say meanings are not in the head. Well, at least that's where I started from, right? So the meanings are not in the head. But okay, so let's get that out there. But so I have a million things to say to that as well. So first, why didn't I talk about the Pluto case, right? So how sneaky of me, I went through this literature and chosen this nice example that fits my story. What about Pluto, right? Didn't it used to be a planet? Yeah, so I think the Pluto case is actually not at all different from what I said here. And I think, in fact, with Pluto as well, you get a similar kind of a problem for the negotiation strategy in particular. Where was that? Here. So it's like you also want to say, we thought that Pluto was a planet. We learned that we were wrong, right? Because we learned about the Kuiper belt, and we learned about the fact that it doesn't clear up its orbit, and so forth.
We declared it to be wrong.
Well, right. So I want to say.
Did.
So I want to say, look, and even that, if you look at how that debate is aging, now it's becoming kind of again controversial whether we should include Pluto or not. So now it's a dwarf planet, which happens not to be a planet, but it's a dwarf planet. And so basically what we're seeing is the kind of a scientific progress. We did learn more about the facts. In fact, we learned about the Kuiper belt. We learned about the fact that Pluto doesn't, fit with the rest of the planet pantheon in a certain kind of a way, and that affected our understanding of whether it's a planet or not, right?
I wouldn't characterize
it's the same kind of a thing that, if you think about it, happens. Just as we said, the stars used to be paintings on the ceilings of the sky, but now we know that's wrong, right? That's again a scientific discovery.
It's different because here we're just changing. It's not a fact about what it actually is, which was the case with being wrong about the stars. Here, we're changing our classification so things that fit together better. But it doesn't change any of the facts about Pluto itself. It just says there are other objects like this, and we want to create a class of such objects.
So here's maybe one way in which I can bring about the kind of intuition I'm working with, and then you can tell me whether that's more satisfactory or not. So one way to think about it is when you came up with a particular term with a particular classification, it was to serve a particular purpose, right? So it's partly an evaluative term. It's planet versus non-planet things, right? It's a point of predication. And if that's how you think about it, then what the term is tracking is something with a particular kind of a function and purpose, right? That serves that for us. But the purpose in itself needn't be transparent to us in any kind of a way up until, we might learn more, and that might mean that we figure out, so it doesn't actually fit, this particular object doesn't actually fit the class that serves a particular purpose of grouping certain things in a certain way, right? That's, again, not a change in meaning. That's just understanding more about how things are so that we can understand what falls within a certain classification. So basically, the argument you are suggesting presupposes that it's transparent to us on the basis of which kind of factors we made a particular classification that's useful. But useful itself is not this kind of transparent notion, right? And that's what matters for these debates about classification. So that's at least what I want to say about the Pluto case. Let's see. So there was a lot in there. So the articulation point. So maybe we appeal to kind of a tolerance principle. But again, so that's kind of an argument. And so I started with a dilemma, right? So you might reject the presuppositions of the debate and say, no, in fact, your background beliefs and intentions are actually what is relevant for what a term means in your in your private dialect, if you like. So our terms are not bound to mean the same thing because we reject the presuppositions that, you know, I started with this assumption, and you might say, no, I'm off the boat already with these guys here. Our terms are not at all determined to mean whatever they mean within our linguistic community. There's variations even within, you know, across speakers in the very meaning of the terms. That's fine. You can do that. I started with a dilemma. Maybe where I ended up makes you to now tolerance my opponents. That's okay. But at least the part of the goal here was to bring about that tension, right, which we thought was missed and what we thought was important, right? So maybe you don't like this kind of a line of reasoning. We think it has been influential and fruitful and want to kind of stick to it. But if you want to kind of run the reductio argument in the other direction, or like if you want to run the modus tollens argument instead of the modus ponens argument, maybe that's what you want to do. But then that would require rejecting that rather than talking about whether that's a case of negotiation or not.